February 1943. The unforgiving sun beat down upon the barren landscape of Tunisia as a massive cloud of dust rose on the horizon. The famed Afrika Korps, led by their legendary desert fox, Erwin Rommel, charged through the Kasserine Pass with confidence bordering on contempt. Before them lay the untested American forces, green troops who had yet to face the full fury of German mechanized warfare. What followed was a brutal awakening for the Americans, a defeat that shook the Allied command to its core. Yet within those blood-soaked sands of North Africa lay the seeds of transformation, a crucible that would forge the American military into a force that would eventually strike terror into the hearts of their German adversaries. The story of America's rise to military dominance in the Mediterranean theater is one of painful lessons, rapid adaptation, and ultimately, overwhelming force. In those early days of 1943, as tanks bearing the Black Cross of the Wehrmacht smashed through American lines, few could have predicted that within months, these same German units would come to fear the very army they had so easily defeated. The journey from humiliation at Kasserine to triumph in Italy represents one of the most remarkable military transformations in modern warfare, testament to American industrial might, logistical prowess, and the capacity to learn from failure. The air hung heavy with dust and smoke as German tanks pushed through the narrow mountain pass in central Tunisia. American forces, dispersed and poorly coordinated by Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall, crumbled under the precise German assault. Equipment failures, tactical errors, and inexperience combined to create a perfect storm of defeat. Tanks were positioned incorrectly, units split apart rather than concentrated for mutual support, and commanders remained far from the front lines. The German advance captured over 6,000 American prisoners, destroyed or captured over 200 tanks, and inflicted thousands of casualties. Rommel himself noted the poor training of the American forces and their inability to coordinate artillery, armor, and infantry. As one German officer remarked in his diary, "These Americans have fine equipment, but they don't seem to know how to use it." In the immediate aftermath of Kasserine, a profound change swept through the American command structure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized the need for immediate reform, replacing Fredendall with the aggressive and demanding General George S. Patton. The transformation began with a brutal assessment of failure. Commanders who had failed to lead effectively were removed, training was intensified, and doctrine was refined. Patton instilled a new spirit of discipline and aggression, famously telling his men, "Americans do not like to lose." Most importantly, the Americans began to apply the tactical lessons they had learned at such a high cost. Tanks would no longer be used in isolation, but in coordination with infantry and artillery in combined arms operations. What the Germans could not fully appreciate at Kasserine was the industrial might that stood behind these American forces. While the Afrika Korps struggled with chronic supply shortages, dwindling fuel reserves, and overextended logistics, American factories worked around the clock, churning out a seemingly endless stream of tanks, planes, trucks, and artillery. The transformation was not merely one of tactics, but of sheer material abundance. By May 1943, when the Axis forces in North Africa finally surrendered at Tunis, they faced an American army that had been reborn, better trained, better led, and overwhelmingly better equipped. The air filled with deafening thunder as hundreds of American artillery pieces opened fire in perfect coordination. The ground trembled beneath the barrage, reducing the carefully constructed German positions to rubble. This was the sound that would come to define American combat power, not just the individual gun, but the symphony of thousands firing in unison. As one German prisoner later confessed, the American artillery was devastating. It seemed endless, with no concern for ammunition shortages. This observation would be repeated by German commanders throughout the Italian campaign. It wasn't just the quality of American artillery that impressed them, but its quantity and the seemingly unlimited supply of shells. The landing at Salerno, Italy, in September 1943 showcased this new American fighting force. When German armor threatened to push the Allied beachhead back into the sea, the Americans responded with a crushing display of firepower. Naval guns from offshore destroyers, tactical air support from the Army Air Forces, and field artillery positioned along the beaches combined to stop the German counterattack cold. A German commander at Salerno complained of the unequal fight his men had endured, trapped under a constant rain of shells and bombs while trying to maneuver. The Americans had discovered their formula for victory: overwhelming firepower coordinated across all arms of service. The North African sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as American artillery crews worked with methodical precision. Gone was the panicked disorganization of Kasserine. In its place stood a well-oiled machine, gun crews who could lay down accurate fire within minutes of receiving coordinates, forward observers who moved with the infantry to direct devastating barrages onto enemy positions, and a logistics chain that ensured ammunition never ran short. The Germans, accustomed to careful conservation of shells due to their own supply limitations, were stunned by the American willingness to expend hundreds of rounds to eliminate even small pockets of resistance. This transformation did not happen by accident. After Kasserine, the Americans subjected their artillery doctrine to ruthless analysis, adopting centralized fire control systems that allowed them to concentrate the fire of dozens or even hundreds of guns on a single target. Fire direction centers were established, where officers used mathematical calculations to coordinate devastating time-on-target barrages, a technique where shells from multiple batteries were timed to arrive simultaneously, giving the enemy no warning and no chance to seek cover. The results were devastating. As one German officer wrote after the war, when the Americans fired, it was as if the sky itself had fallen. There was no escaping it, no enduring it. Men broke under the strain of constant bombardment. The Tunisian campaign became the proving ground for this new approach. At the battles of El Guettar and Matur in March and April 1943, the Americans demonstrated their rapidly growing prowess. When Rommel attempted to replicate his success at Kasserine with another armored thrust, he found a transformed opponent. American tanks no longer operated independently, but in close coordination with infantry and, most importantly, artillery. Tank destroyers positioned in carefully prepared defensive positions ambushed advancing German armor while artillery disrupted their formations. The result was a stunning reversal. Rommel's attack was not just halted, but thrown back with heavy losses. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the final stages of the North African campaign. In the rugged terrain of northern Tunisia, the Americans demonstrated a growing mastery of combined arms warfare. Artillery preparations softened German defensive positions before infantry assaults. When the Germans attempted to counterattack, they found themselves caught in killing zones pre-registered by American gunners. German officers, interrogated after their capture, repeatedly mentioned the psychological impact of American artillery, its accuracy, its volume, and the impossibility of escaping its effects. "We could see your infantry coming and prepare to meet them," one German major stated, "but we could never escape your artillery. It followed us everywhere, even into positions we believed were safe." The landscape of Sicily provided a new challenge for the evolving American fighting force. Here, in the mountainous interior of the island, the Germans expected to negate the American advantage in mechanized warfare and artillery. Yet the Americans demonstrated a remarkable adaptability, using pack mules to transport artillery pieces to seemingly inaccessible positions from which they could support infantry moving through the rugged terrain. When the Germans established defensive lines across mountain passes, American forces simply outflanked them, their artillery keeping the defenders pinned, while infantry found paths through territory the Germans had considered impassable. By the time of the Italian campaign, the transformation was so complete that German commanders began to adjust their entire defensive doctrine in response to American capabilities. Recognizing the devastating impact of American artillery, they abandoned their previous practice of establishing dense defensive positions in favor of more dispersed deployments. Traditional defensive lines gave way to defense in depth, with small scattered outposts designed to minimize the effect of artillery barrages. Yet even these adaptations proved insufficient. American forward observers, moving with the lead infantry elements, could call down precise fire on these positions, while the sheer volume of American artillery meant that they could saturate entire areas with fire, neutralizing even dispersed defenses. The American approach to river crossings particularly impressed German observers. Rivers had traditionally formed formidable defensive barriers, allowing defenders to concentrate their forces at likely crossing points. Yet the Americans developed techniques to overcome these obstacles with remarkable speed and efficiency. Artillery would lay down smoke screens to blind German observers, while simultaneously suppressing known defensive positions. Engineer units would rapidly construct pontoon bridges under this protective umbrella of fire, allowing infantry and tanks to cross in force before the Germans could react effectively. What had once been defensive positions that could hold for weeks or months were now being overcome in hours or days. In the mountains of Italy, the Americans faced perhaps their greatest test. Here, in terrain that heavily favored the defender, The German forces expected to negate American advantages in mobility and firepower. Yet once again, the Americans adapted. Artillery forward observers accompanied even the smallest infantry units, calling down precise fire on German positions hidden among the rocks and trees. When direct fire was impossible due to the steep terrain, the Americans perfected the art of indirect fire, using mathematical calculations to drop shells with pinpoint accuracy on positions they couldn't even see. German units hiding in ravines or on reverse slopes, positions that should have been safe from artillery, found themselves under devastating fire directed by observers in light aircraft circling overhead. The battle for Monte Cassino in early 1944 demonstrated both the challenge of the Italian terrain and the growing sophistication of American operations. Initial frontal assaults against the heavily fortified German positions failed despite massive artillery support. Yet rather than continuing to batter themselves against these defenses, the Americans sought alternative approaches. Engineers created paths through terrain previously considered impassable, allowing forces to outflank the German positions. Artillery fire was coordinated with air support to keep the defenders pinned down while infantry maneuvered. The Americans displayed a tactical flexibility that contrasted sharply with their rigid approach at Kasserine just a year earlier. Perhaps most impressive to the German commanders was the American capacity for logistical miracles. Roads appeared as if by magic across terrain that the Germans had considered impassable. Bridges destroyed by German engineers were replaced within hours by American combat engineers. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies flowed to the front lines in quantities that seemed impossible to the fuel-starved Wehrmacht. In the mountains of Italy, where German forces relied on mules to carry supplies to forward positions, the Americans deployed fleets of trucks and jeeps, using their engineering skills to create and maintain roads under the most challenging conditions. As one German general noted with resignation, "We could delay the Americans but never stop them. They simply built a road around any obstacle we created." The evolution of the American soldier himself did not go unnoticed by German commanders. The green troops who had fled in panic at Kasserine had been replaced by battle-hardened veterans who fought with determination and skill. American infantry learned to work in close coordination with their supporting arms, calling in artillery and air support with precision. Their tactical doctrine evolved to emphasize aggressive, small-unit actions, with squad and platoon leaders taking initiative rather than waiting for orders. German prisoners increasingly reported that American patrols dominated the night, making it dangerous for German units to move or resupply after dark. By the winter of 1944, as the Allied forces pushed toward the Gothic Line in northern Italy, the transformation was complete. The American army had evolved from an inexperienced force into a military machine that combined overwhelming firepower with tactical sophistication and logistical excellence. German defenders found themselves facing an opponent that could bring crushing artillery fire on any position, bypass strong points through superior mobility, and sustain offensive operations regardless of terrain or weather. As one German commander wrote in his final report, "The American army we face today bears no resemblance to the force we defeated at Kasserine. They have learned from every mistake and grown stronger with each battle." The artillery had become the signature weapon of the American forces. While German observers had initially been dismissive of American gunnery skills, they soon gained a healthy respect for the devastating firepower American batteries could deliver. Unlike the artillery of other armies, which was often limited by ammunition shortages, American guns seemed to fire without restriction. One German officer captured in the Po Valley in 1945 remarked, "We began to dread the sound of your artillery adjusting fire. We knew that within minutes, shells would be falling with incredible accuracy, and there would be no end to it. Your gunners fire more shells in 1 hour than ours can fire in a day." The psychological impact of this firepower cannot be overstated. German veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Russians often commented that while the Soviet artillery could be devastating in its volume, it lacked the precision of the American guns. American time-on-target barrages, where shells from dozens of batteries arrived simultaneously without warning, proved particularly demoralizing. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of ranging shots, a few shells fired to establish the target's location, and would brace themselves for the barrage they knew would follow. But against American time-on-target techniques, there was no warning, just the sudden, overwhelming arrival of hundreds of shells. The effect on morale was crushing. The coordination between American artillery and air power further distinguished their operations from those of other Allied forces. Forward air controllers, often operating from light observation aircraft, could direct both artillery fire and airstrikes onto German positions with devastating effect. This integration of different arms created a dilemma for German defenders. If they dispersed to minimize the effect of artillery, they made themselves vulnerable to air attack. If they concentrated for mutual protection against aircraft, they presented perfect targets for artillery. As one German commander noted in his report, the Americans have created a system where there is no safe response. Every defensive measure we take is countered by their ability to adapt and bring different forms of firepower to bear. This revolution in American fighting power was not lost on the German High Command. Reports flowed back to Berlin describing the transformation of the American forces from the defeatable amateurs of Kasserine to the overwhelming juggernaut they had become. German intelligence assessments, once dismissive of American combat capabilities, began to acknowledge the growing threat they posed. By 1944, German commanders were requesting reinforcements and supplies with increasing urgency, warning that without them they could not hope to contain the American advance. The conquest of Sicily and Italy served as more than just a stepping stone to the liberation of Europe. It was the proving ground where the American military came of age. From the deserts of Tunisia to the mountains of northern Italy, American forces underwent a transformation from inexperience to excellence. The lessons learned in these campaigns would later be applied on the beaches of Normandy and in the push into Germany itself. The Germans, who had once dismissed the Americans as amateurs with good equipment, came to fear them as perhaps the most formidable fighting force they faced. As the war in Italy ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, German prisoners increasingly spoke of the psychological impact of facing American forces. "We knew when we faced the British or the Canadians what to expect," one officer stated during interrogation. But the Americans were different. They had no fixed doctrine, they adapted constantly, and they never seemed to run out of ammunition or fuel or men. Just when you thought you had them figured out, they would do something unexpected. And always there was that terrible artillery. The spring of 1945 found the once mighty Wehrmacht in full retreat across the Po Valley of northern Italy. The German forces, which had once moved with such confidence through the Kasserine Pass, now fought a desperate rearguard action against an American juggernaut they could neither outfight nor outmaneuver. American artillery, once derided by German veterans for its inaccuracy, now delivered devastating fire with scientific precision. American infantry, once scattered in panic before German armor, now advanced methodically behind rolling barrages, flanking and isolating German strongpoints. American engineers, overcoming every obstacle the retreating Germans left in their path, maintained the momentum of the advance with bridges and roads constructed at unprecedented speed. The final German surrender in Italy in May 1945 marked the end of a remarkable journey for the American army. In just over 2 years, they had transformed from the defeated novices of Kasserine into the architects of one of history's most successful military campaigns. The Germans, who had once viewed them with contempt, now surrendered to them by the tens of thousands. Their once vaunted military machine broken by the very force they had so easily defeated in those early days in Tunisia. What caused this extraordinary transformation? The answers lie partly in the American capacity for institutional learning. Unlike armies bound by rigid doctrine and tradition, the American forces demonstrated a remarkable willingness to analyze their failures and adapt accordingly. After Kasserine, the Americans conducted brutal after-action reviews, identifying weaknesses in training, equipment, leadership, and doctrine. They did not seek to assign blame, but rather to find solutions. This culture of continuous improvement stands in stark contrast to the German approach, which increasingly relied on the mythologized superiority of German soldiers rather than addressing systemic weaknesses. The American industrial base played a crucial role as well. While German forces in the Mediterranean increasingly struggled with shortages of everything from fuel to ammunition to spare parts, the Americans operated in a state of material abundance that seemed miraculous to their opponents. This was not merely a matter of quantity but of quality as well. American equipment evolved throughout the campaign, incorporating lessons learned in combat. Tanks received improved armor and more powerful guns. Artillery pieces gained greater range and accuracy, and even the individual equipment carried by infantry soldiers improved constantly. The Germans, by contrast, found themselves increasingly relying on obsolete equipment or hastily produced substitutes as their industrial base crumbled under Allied bombing. The sands of North Africa had witnessed the painful birth of American combat power, as an untested army learned harsh lessons against a veteran opponent. But from those same sands rose a military force that would help secure Allied victory. A transformation so complete that the very commander who had once defeated them, Erwin Rommel, would later acknowledge with grudging respect. The Americans displayed a remarkable ability to learn from their mistakes. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in adaptability and material superiority. In the final analysis, this combination proved unbeatable. Today, as we walk among the silent rows of white crosses in the American military cemeteries at Nettuno and Florence, we remember not just the sacrifice of these young men, but also their journey from defeat to victory. The transformation of the American army in the Mediterranean theater stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in military history, a testament to the capacity to learn from failure and the indomitable spirit that turned disaster into triumph. From the forgotten sands of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, they forged a fighting force that would become the most feared by their German adversaries, not just for their overwhelming firepower and endless supplies, but for their growing tactical excellence and unwavering determination. Their story calls to us across the decades, inviting us to remember not just how they died, but how they fought and how they won, turning the bitter defeat of Kasserine Pass into the seeds of ultimate victory.